I think it's just overwhelming for CMS to really kind of put in like an algorithm associated with that to kind of say this is what you should do in every case, because every case is so different.
There's a ton of factors that go into a liability case.
When it comes to considering Medicare's interests, workers' compensation is relatively straightforward. But liability? Not so much. In this episode of Medivest, the podcast, we discuss MSP compliance best practices in liability settlements. Worst practice? Do nothing at all.
Today we are talking about MSAs and liability, or Medicare compliance in general and liability. Craig, I'm going to go right to you off the bat here.
Fun stuff.
You're talking to people in the liability field all the time about MSP. What's the stuff you're hearing?
Yes, there is a lot of misconceptions out there. Something that I talk about frequently with clients. The biggest misconception, I would say, and the thing I hear from most frequently, is this is a work comp thing and it doesn't apply to liability. And it's simply not true. If you look at the statute, there's 5 primary plans that pay before Medicare, and liability is one of those plans. And the other thing that I hear on a regular basis is, well, there hasn't been any guidance issued on this. So with a lack of, there's no guidance on this, so I'm not going to do anything. I don't need to worry about this. And I will say, you do have some attorneys telling other attorneys bad information. I mean, it's just, I do see it. So I spend a lot of time, I do a lot of the CLE sessions for Medivest, where I'm setting up either with law firms or state TLAs or bar associations, just specifically to talk on this issue, because there's so much bad information out there about it. Now, I would like to be very clear. There is not a whole lot of guidance from CMS on this issue. It is still part of that statute from 1980. It's one of the 5 primary plans. So you need to do something. And I'm always very clear that it doesn't mean that you have to do a set-aside. There is no statute that requires you to do a Medicare set-aside. What you have to do is you have to take Medicare's interest into consideration based upon the statute, right? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. But I would say that's the biggest thing I come across when we're talking about Medicare compliance. Sorry, shoes. We're talking about Medicare compliance and liability settlements. There's just a lot of bad information out there.
It is interesting, though, right, that it's attorneys sometimes that are pointing to the concept of whether there is or isn't guidance, because they know that there's this written guidance in the form of the WCMSA reference guide, and they don't have that guidance, that written guidance on the liability side. But attorneys would also, or should also, agree that the federal statute is a higher level of authority, for example, than the guidance. In fact, it's a higher level of authority than even regulations that interpret or implement that statute, right? So you have the federal statute. The only thing higher than the federal statute is the Supreme Court's decisions, right? In terms of, and then the Constitution, of course. But so your Constitution, then you have your Supreme Court's interpretations of the law, and then you have federal statutes, and then you have regulations, and then you have guidance lower than that. So, the concept, so when the Medicare secondary payer statute says, is Congress's statement, right, to Medicare saying, do not pay, you shall not pay, but if you do pay, you must chase or get reimbursed for those conditional payments. And they define what conditional payments are, injury-related and Medicare covered, but they don't define it or limit it to the date of settlement. It opens up this concept that a federal court, for example, could interpret that a conditional payment absolutely applies for future injury-related and Medicare-covered payments, right? There's no denying that. And the fact is that the fact that there's a regulatory agency, CMS, in charge of administering the Medicare plan or the Medicare program, but in the light that the Supreme Court of the United States has overturned the Chevron deference in the Loper Bright Enterprises case, it leaves open the possibility that things could change in the future with respect to recoveries by Medicare for this. I'm not saying that there's anything looming or directly happening, but
Right.
it is it's an interesting backdrop that we're working in today.
Yeah, that's an interesting change that perhaps portends some developments in the future, particularly in the liability space. What's different, for those who don't know, what's different about a liability case compared to a work comp case where that might complicate MSP or?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with, we have guidelines, we have a lot of instruction. We have the work comp reference guide that really outlines when you're looking, especially future medicals on a case with respect to like an MSA. You don't have that sort of guidance on a liability case, but there's a lot of other components that come into a liability case that you wouldn't see in a comp case. You may have policy limits. You may have contributing factors. You may have multiple settlements on the case with multiple different parties for the same accidents and injuries. It's something that I see all the time, and you really got to break that up and find a way to cover the statute from. And I'm specifically talking about futures at this point, Medicare's future exposure. But you need to be able to take those into account. It gets into this idea of apportionment. On a liability settlement. If you have somebody who's injured and gets paralyzed in an accident and they need $2 million in future medical care, but you got a policy limit of $100,000, how are you going to handle that issue? And again, no guidance from CMS on it. And I love to say this. I love to use Medicare's language like they do and say you need to do what's reasonable. What's reasonable? Right? Is it reasonable to say, hey, this is a $50,000 policy limit. This person's going to need $2 million in future medical care. How do we consider Medicare's interest on the case? Have the attorney, get paid on their case? I've seen cases where the attorneys have almost completely, waived their fees because the recovery is so small based on a policy limit. And you have this whole Medicare component where you might have a lien that needs to be paid back to Medicare or an Advantage plan. And on top of that, you have future medicals on a case. What are you going to do in that situation? There's a lot of tricky pieces to it. And I love using this word, it's an assumption of risk, right? How comfortable are you doing what you're doing on the case? Does Medicare have an interest in the case? Okay, they do. What are you doing to cover that? Are there liens? Are they getting paid back? How much is the individual putting into their pocket? Are they walking away with almost nothing by the time this case is settled? Because it's a policy limit, or are they walking away with a substantial amount of money, but they need a substantial amount of future care, right? So these are all the questions you got to work through on a case in liability that you're not necessarily going to see in workers' comp. The settlement amount's the settlement amount. In liability, the settlement amount can be dictated by the policy limit.
That's true. And I like to think of it in terms of it just from a general, like common person's perspective. It's like the buckets of damages. So, workers' compensation, I mean, this may be obvious, but in workers' compensation, a person is out of work sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're out of work as a result of their injury. So they have past wage loss. And then if it's a significant injury, it may be a situation where they have some sort of a disability. It could be a permanent one or it could be a partial. And then there's going to be this issue of whether they have a loss of earnings capacity in the future, so there's a future wage loss. And then the other thing is the medicals. So it's like the past medicals, how much was paid for them to date, and then what are their needs for their medicals that are injury related in the future. So that's essentially 4 buckets of damages. Whereas in liability, it's not that it's infinite, but like everyone knows, they've heard the term pain and suffering, right? So it's like physically what the person went through. They also may have been very active or had other activities they like to engage in, whether they're artistic or, recreational or competitive even. And then those, are often the phrase would be a loss of enjoyment of life. Then you have, if they're married, their spouse may have, it's called a derivative claim called a loss of consortium. And if they were, minor children, they may have like a loss of companionship with their parents. So there's a change because, they can't attend their events. They can't attend major life milestones, graduations, weddings, those types of things. So those are, right, and those non-economic damages in some liability cases are the overwhelming majority of the entire claim. So when we're talking about futures in the Medicare set-aside realm, or the consideration of Medicare's future interest in a settlement realm, in a liability case, you have to really break down those buckets. So you have, the same things as wage loss in the past, as well as your loss of earning capacity. So those are, along with your medicals, your past medicals and your future medicals, all those are economic damages. But this concept of the non-economic damages is huge. And then Craig touched on it, comparative negligence. It's it's kind of like, well, you think about it, what would the defense say? Like, so the settlement that occurs, if there is no policy limit problem, meaning there's plenty of money under a policy limit to cover you, were there any actions by the actual plaintiff in a liability case that they took or failed to take that would diminish the amount of money that would be paid to them because they were partially at fault? So basically, workers' comp versus liability, they're both emanating from state law, but workers' compensation law is driven by statute and it's very procedural in nature, whereas liability has a lot more opening. Let's say there's not ORM in liability. Right. So no one accepts medicals along the way. It's very rare. There's some unusual internal hospital type cases where they might, where you could have a situation where somebody agrees to pay medical bills along the way and then they later settle. But usually in the liability scenario, everything's denied even after settlement, and they right. And so nobody's paying, right, for the bills other than a healthcare plan, or in a case like Medicare, where that's where they would step in, because the liability carrier saying we're not paying, we'd have no liability while they're doing discovery or while they're evaluating the case, and that's where you have these conditional payments that arise on the Medicare side, and to look at the futures. You always need to look at those futures, but you have to take it into consideration at the same time as looking at, are there any pasts? Because you want to know what are the liens. Because if there's, and also, was the person a veteran, and did they go to a VA facility, or were they privately, did they have private health insurance through TRICARE? And so, or was it an employer plan that might be an ERISA plan, right, in a liability sense? So, like, did any other plan pay? And what are those types of recovery rights looking like? And especially if there's some sort of federal statute, federal employees, FEBA, or railroad workers, FELA, any of those other entities may have pretty strong recovery rights that need to be taken into consideration also, right? So it's not always as easy, basically. It's way more complex.
And in a liability case, most of the time, money is not changing hands. Money's not changing hands, treatment's not being paid for, well, the case is ongoing, right? So that individual is going to run to Medicare and use Medicare, or one of these other plans, if they have private health insurance. All those things can kind of complicate all of this. So you may end up in a situation where, things are being paid for by a private health insurance, and if you don't know that and you haven't reached out, to investigate that, you can end up, that individual can get a surprise after their case settles saying, hey, you owe us money.
Yeah.
Right. So
you could have a plaintiff that was enrolled in traditional Medicare in year one, and you could have, let's say it's a 4-year statute of limitations, which is not uncommon. It's pretty common in many states for a liability case, sometimes shorter in med mal. But the fact is that they could be on a traditional Medicare plan in year one. They could go to a privately administered Medicare Advantage plan in year 2. They could go back to traditional Medicare in year 3. And now in year 4, it's up in the air. It's like, who's paying your bills now? And each of those entities, in that case, traditional Medicare and the Medicare Advantage plan of choice at that time, would have a right of recovery. And then you're also, expected to kind of consider are you being compensated for futures that are injury related and Medicare covered, and then putting that money aside. But so you want to really consider partnering with somebody that's going to look at all those and evaluate that.
And
I know someone.
Well, one thing I want to add to that too, from the standpoint of future medicals and liability, this is one of my favorites. I get this one a lot. What if I just say there's none of this money's for future medical? And then I always bring that back to, well, what do the medical records on the case say? What do the records on the case say? If they, this person's fine, doesn't need any future medical treatment, language. Throw language in there as long as it's backed up. If Medicare were ever to look at a case, they're going to look at the most recent, the assumption is the most recent 2 years of medical records on the case, similar to what they would do with comp if they were to look into a file. I'm not saying that's something that's going to happen, but again, with that lack of guidance, that's what you would want to look at. So do the medical records say they need future treatment, or are they fine? Are they fine? They don't need anything else. They've gotten back to normal. You may just use language and say, hey, no future treatment's being recommended based on the medical records, therefore we're not going to establish this. So there's some options.
In the workers' compensation side of that, the concept used to be that you could submit a zero MSA, whether it was a legal zero or a medical zero, and Craig's really referring right there to a medical zero. But they do have language, at least from, on the reference guide side, on the workers' comp reference guide, discussing that in those scenarios, they would be at least looking for the treating physician to say in a written document, right, in the medical record, within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that the individual does not need future care related to the injury. And
document the file.
Yeah, so document the file. But that's where you would want to have maybe if it's not clear in the medical record as it exists, sometimes a nurse can have a consultation with a doctor, or you could have a doctor have a consultation with a doctor. But basically, having an interview with a doctor where they would document the file appropriately to determine if yes, that's the case, that you have an actual medical zero.
Clear their debt, clear your desk. Take back your valuable time with Clear Liens, Medivest's lien resolution service. Call us today at 877-725-2467 or visit us at medivest.com.
So you mentioned lack of guidance. So I'm just going to put this question out here, because my understanding is that the liability market, if you want to call it a market, is much bigger than workers' compensation. There are far more claims in liability than there are in workers' compensation.
Bigger settlements too.
And the settlements are typically bigger. So you can make a reasonable argument that Medicare's exposure
is bigger on liability than it is
bigger.
on comp.
So why do you think that CMS has not issued guidance in liability to this date? Why are they mainly focused on workers' compensation from a issuing of guidance standpoint?
Smaller and more regulated, possibly.
Easier for them to do? Like what?
Yeah.
I think honestly it's kind of strange, but it's like a mathematical calculation when you literally have those 4 buckets of damages. Mm-hmm. is easier to manage, right? It's because it's like mathematically you say, here's what was your wage loss, what's your future wage loss, what are your past medicals, okay, so and here's the settlement amount, how much is the future medical, right? So it's like it's
just easier to do,
easier to solve. Yeah. It's more like algebra, and I don't know that I should even make an analogy to calculus, because quite honestly, I didn't do that well in calculus. but I would say that no, all those factors we talked about, the policy limit, like what do you do in a policy limit case? It's $1 million case and it settles for $100,000. It might be a $15 million case, and it's even if it settles for $1 million, it sounds like ooh, that's a lot. But what about all those non-economic damages? The person is, catastrophically injured. And unfortunately, as a professional administrator, we have many of our members that are paraplegic or quadriplegic. And, I've had conversations with them, some of our members that, it's amazing. I'm always inspired, quite honestly, like how they get along in this world after such a devastating injury, and that they can do so many things, and are, oftentimes, barring any kind of traumatic brain injury, can do so many things intellectually, which is so impressive and inspiring. But at the same time, it's just so sad to understand like all the accommodations and changes in their life that they need to address. But the point is that it's hard to calculate like what was that loss, and it's way more than those medicals, and it's way more like than that hospital stay, and so you're looking at the concept when you have a limited settlement, for example. Or maybe when you had some comparative negligence, maybe they were speeding, but the other person crossed in front of them. So the other person violated their right of way, and then there's an allegation that they were speeding. But they were deserving of being reimbursed, and they have all those other buckets of damages. I think it's just overwhelming for CMS to really kind of put in like an algorithm associated with that to kind of say this is what you should do in every case, because every case is so different.
There's a ton of factors that go into a liability case, and I think part of it is maybe they don't fully understand all those factors, and that would also require them if they issued guidance, would it make things easier for us to advise our clients on how to move forward? Sure. But at the same time, I'm also nervous about what that would mean, because they would start having to take positions on some of these issues and how they're going to handle them. And if they don't fully understand all those issues on a liability case, because they're, again, like Nat said, they're a lot more complex, they're going to have to make some decisions on that, and how is that going to work? What does it mean for them? Are they going to come out and talk about apportionment and where they're comfortable with it or how they want it done? Right? But they have to weigh all these other factors into it. And I think it's just a tremendous amount of information they've got to look at and make decisions on.
And I want to point out that although we're talking about futures essentially with MSP compliance with respect to futures and liability, but the corollary to that is the conditional payment side. So like, for example, if Medicare made payments in a case that's constrained by a lower policy limit settlement. So those are the medicals, and yes, they have by the MSP law a right, and actually they are charged with the responsibility of collecting their conditional payments. So it's interesting. They'll go through their conditional payment correspondence practice, like the CPLs, the letters, and sometimes if maybe the plaintiff's attorney didn't tell them about the claim, and a Section 111 report comes in from the primary plan side, the RRE for the carrier, and they find out that there was a settlement, they'll go right to a CPN, a conditional payment notice, and then within 30 days of that, they are generating a demand that doesn't even recognize the procurement cost reduction. So sometimes we'll get involved like at the 11th hour and find out the settlement details, get the attorney's fees, the expenses, get that in there. But of course, we would like to get it earlier for their benefit so we could see were there conditional payments that were not related to the claim. Almost always we find those. We want to get those taken out before you even get to the point so that you get a demand that is appropriate, right? But when that settlement occurs and you pay the demand, so ideally you're paying a demand that doesn't have any unrelated claims, and it already has a procurement cost reduction. But what a lot of people don't know is after the fact, right, even after Medicare has received their funds, there is an opportunity, and it's not in every case, but there are times when either because of financial hardship of that Medicare beneficiary, they may be entitled to a waiver, right? A lot of attorneys like to attack and request their waiver initially, and they get denied, and then they just pay the demand. The second phase of that is actually, well, there's a few different phases, but one of the next phase would be a compromise request. And they can make a reduction request based on that concept of apportionment, but on the backside, on the past interest. And actually, sometimes if Medicare understands that there were a lot of other factors here, pain and suffering, loss of enjoyment of life, the loss of consortium that we talked about, those types of other non-economic damages, based on fairness, they may agree to reduce the amount. And even if after a demand has been paid, they will send a refund back. And it makes, nothing makes me happier to have an injured party receive some money back and get a higher net than they ever expected. And then there's also the appeal process. So the demand itself, if there was either an error in the demand or that's considered a determination. So you can make a request for the first thing is a first level appeal redetermination request. And then there's a 4-step administrative appeal process. And there are times when you need to move it all the way up. And then the 5th step is actually an appeal to the federal district court. So to have those types of disputes heard by somebody to make sure that sometimes the initial response from a CMS practitioner, let's just say, is not as favorable as it should be. And so you need someone that would advocate for the injured party to make sure that they're getting a fair shake.
Okay, so let me ask these questions from this perspective. I'm an attorney, and I am nearing settlement, and I have to figure out how I'm going to address the MSP question. You've talked a little bit about addressing the liens, and obviously doing some lien resolution there across all the payers who may have a claim on those settlement proceeds and getting as much reduction as possible there is going to free up some cash to actually answer the futures question a little bit better, right? We have seen situations where folks have tried to pay off liens with MSA money. They try to take their future money to pay their past. Not advised. So where do you start in that conversation? What's the place that you begin? What's the questions that you ask?
I always start with the basics. Is your client currently receiving Medicare benefits? Are they receiving Social Security disability? Have they applied for disability? How old are they? Are they over 62 and a half? Those are always the questions I start with. If somebody calls up and we have a conversation, they tell me they got a Medicare lien. I know the answer to that question already. Okay, they have Medicare benefits. So that's always where I start. The next thing that I usually roll into is I ask them, okay, does your client need future medical care related to this case? Yes or no, based on the medical records. So then we kind of, the ones, where somebody says, no, they don't, the medical records all say they don't need anything else. They're good. They're not receiving medications. They're not getting anything else. Then we kind of go in a different direction. We go in a different direction. We usually start talking about language to put into the settlement to paper your file and address Medicare. That's usually where that conversation will lead. If they do need future medical care on the case, what I'll usually end up doing is saying, okay, then we start talking about the injuries. What kind of things are being recommended in the medical records? What settlement amount are you looking at? Because those are going to really guide the process. If somebody says, hey, this settlement is $10,000, I have my attorney's fees, I've got a lien of $2,000 that needs to be paid back. The exposure on a case like that is going to be very minimal, right? So the question is, does it make sense to allocate something for futures in that situation, knowing that the maximum amount they would come back after in a post-settlement environment, in a worst-case scenario, would be what the individual put in their pocket. So if that was $3,000, their exposure would be limited to $3,000. Now, if somebody needs a serious amount of medical care, your quadriplegia case, your TBIs, they need a lot of medical care. They're going for visits on a regular basis, receiving lots of medications. You want to take a more conservative approach, right? And for the attorneys, what I usually tell the attorneys on a liability case is, look, what you do is you want to protect your client's future benefits. You want to address this statute. You have an obligation to your client to address these issues, being their representative in this settlement. And one of the worst things that you can do is completely ignore this issue and not even discuss it with the client, because that has repercussions down the road. And Medicare's primary enforcement mechanism is denial of payments. And usually what happens is, if this issue isn't addressed, Medicare is aware of the case because of Section 111 reporting. It's been reported to them. They know the body parts, the codes. what happens is that individual tries to run this through Medicare. Medicare denies it, right? Usually what happens is the first phone call is back to the attorney in a post-settlement environment going, hey, I tried to run this through Medicare. Medicare's not paying for it. What do I do, right? That's where the attorney has exposure if they've never even discussed this issue with their client. So the question is, what does future medical look like? What is the exposure on the case? Is there a minimal amount of exposure? Is there a tremendous amount of exposure? And I've seen it run in all different directions. You know, I've seen a case where they were settling for $30 million. You had a woman who was in a vegetative state and full-time assisted care facility. A massive, massive case on both Medicare and Medicaid, right? And I talked with the attorneys. I let them know what the exposure was on the case. And the answer I got out of it was, Medicare hasn't issued any guidance, so we're not going to do anything. You know, and that was a tough one. That one stuck with me for a very long time because I know this lady's going to be in trouble. She was young. She was 24 years old. And I know that at some point Medicare is going to deny those payments. And then she's probably going to roll back to Medicaid. And I hope that something's being done to protect those Medicaid benefits, because if those are gone, she is going to be in deep trouble. And her family's going to be in a lot of really bad situations when it comes trying to get treatment.
Mm-hmm. And and the unfortunate reality is that not every settlement is sufficient enough that if they lost like a significant benefit, like a Medicaid benefit, to cover it. So that's where the world of like the special needs trust we'll be discussing, separately. Mm-hmm. But to make sure that, there's many times when it's probably more important to protect the benefits that they have right now than the settlement that is happening. So but the point is there are mechanisms to allow them to receive settlement proceeds, but not directly in their name, but through like a trust, a pooled trust or a special needs trust, that could still allow them to have some of those kind of state or other need-based benefits.
Protecting benefits is the key, and especially when you have cases with a lot more exposure on them. Mm-hmm. You want to protect those benefits for that individual. As the attorney, you want to make sure you're at least addressing the issues related to those benefits. And again, when we started this, those common misconceptions that this is a work comp issue and I don't need to be concerned about it, this directly impacts the client. And a lot of people don't really understand what that means long term. Right. And I've seen everything from some attorneys who are like, this is a client of mine from 6 years ago and I still talk to him, we have a great relationship. And I've seen other attorneys that go, hey, I'm done with this case, man, I don't want to be involved anymore.
Right.
Attorney,
I'll just say this, that from an ethical perspective, the individual, whether it's the Supreme Court of that state, typically, and the bar associations of that state, that they regulate the attorneys' licenses for the attorneys. Generally speaking, the rules of professional responsibility are such that attorneys absolutely not only have a fiduciary duty to act in their best interest of their clients, but those responsibilities are delineated by a variety of rules, including having competence to be able to handle the case itself, the type of case. Is it too complex? Maybe they need to go to a specialist. And that could include whether spotting the issues of is the person receiving SSI? So that's a federal need-based benefit, or the state need-based benefits like Medicaid, right? Or, and then they would look at, is there a Medicare component here? If they're on disability, within 2 years after they start receiving those payments, they're going to be on Medicare. Are they noticing this? Are they informing their client so that the client has informed consent to whatever the future plans are? So the plan for future care, is vital, but informing the client and finding out really what is the client's risk tolerance. Like, do you have a client that is very concerned about their Medicare benefits? Would they rather, even in light of the fact that there's a federal statute that's clear on its face, but that there's a regulatory environment that maybe isn't as clear, and then there's a less of a clarity with respect to guidance? If you explain that to some clients, they would say, I like the idea that I would have some money set aside that would be specifically reserved for this. I am okay with the fact that money, because otherwise it's like they're going to be using their future settlement money for these injuries if Medicare denies them anyway. But having it set aside, that might put somebody's mind at ease. So it's not always really the attorney's decision. They really need to get informed consent from their client to be in good ethical stead.
I've worked on some of those cases where the attorney's like, I've gone over this with the client. I'll jump on calls and I'll talk directly with the individual as well in conjunction with the attorney, and they just say, I don't care. I'm not concerned about this, and I'm not going to do it, right? So I always tell attorneys, my job is not to tell you what to do. My job is to let you know what the options are and let you decide where you and your client are comfortable, right? If there was a statute related to this that said you have to do X, Y, and Z, I can just push that across the table and go, here you go. This is why you need to do this, But again, there's no guidance on it. So it is an assumption of risk. But my job really is to, especially with the attorney, is to let them know what the risks are, let them know where their exposure is, and make sure the individual is aware of how this impacts them in a post-settlement environment. And, at the end of the day, I feel like if I've had that conversation, whichever direction they choose to go, as long as I've given them the information, I can sleep okay at night. With the exception of that case I was just talking about earlier. That one has stayed with me. That was probably 13, 14 years ago. Yeah. And I just thought it was a really bad situation.
According to this conversation, it sounds to me like the major priority is to protect those benefits, particularly if you are going to have future medical needs and you are not confident that your proceeds from your settlement are enough to cover that. You want to make sure that, for instance, those federal entitlements that you've paid into are entitled to now are in place for the future. And secondary is the name of the game there. If you make a reasonable projection and funding, and you spend that money appropriately in a way that is compliant, then you can demonstrate that to CMS that you have done that. CMS will use Medicare to pay for your needs going forward. Okay. It will pay secondary if you can demonstrate that you've exhausted it effectively, which is why, obviously, getting a professional administrator involved to do that is a good idea, if it makes sense. But
and to add to that, on a liability case, you do have those situations where somebody says, okay, well, I think I'm going to need more care. I think my condition's going to deteriorate over time, and that because these settlements are really a snapshot in time. What's going on at the time of settlement? Nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody looks into the future and says, hey, we know exactly what's going to happen, right? They're looking at it as a snapshot in time. I stole that from Nat, by the way. It's a snapshot in time. So from that point forward, if somebody thinks that their condition's going to deteriorate and they're going to have more bills as time goes on, all the more reason to make sure that if you're relying on Medicare, that you're protecting those benefits, because those funds that are set aside, if they become exhausted before that person's life expectancy is up and they're still alive and they burn through that money, they're going to want to make sure that they did everything right and that they have a plan going forward and Medicare steps in, right? And if you don't address this issue at all, and I'm going to say it again, it's much better, if you're going that route and you have future exposure, we're talking about future medicals here, to set aside a piece instead of do nothing and have Medicare assume everything that person put in their pocket, because there's all this other, you have policy limits, you have loss of consortium, you have all these other things that come into play. Maybe some of the money was for a family member as part of the settlement, or that loss of consortium claim for maybe a spouse or something like that. Is Medicare going to look at that and go, okay, well, you put $50,000 in your pocket, but 20 of this went to your wife, but we're going to assume the entire amount out of the whole settlement. There's a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. So it's better to take a cautious approach, and the more exposure you have, the more conservative you really want to be with it.
Okay, I think that's a great place to wrap. Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.